Hey friends, welcome to the Healthy Christian Leader podcast brought to you by the Aaron Ministries Network. In today's episode, we get to hear from Pastor Danny Smith. Danny challenges Christian leaders to consider the cultivation of courage as a key part of growth in the life of every healthy leader in church. How can Christian leaders be courageous in a culture that's engineered to discourage courage among people of faith? Danny shares how it starts with a faulty perception of God. As we cultivate courage, we must revisit the question, can God be trusted? Today's episode is going to help you, so let's jump right into it.
Well, greetings in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. My name is Danny Smith, and for the last 11 years, I've had the privilege of serving as a lead pastor at Middleton Baptist Church in the beautiful Annapolis Valley. We're continuing our theme this month of Healthy Leader, Healthy Church, and I've been asked if I would provide some thoughts on the healthy church part of our theme. Today I want us to explore a topic that we don't readily think of when it comes to thinking about a healthy church and what that might look like. I want us to talk today about courage. And I hope to show today that a church that is growing into becoming a healthy church will, as part of that health, also be growing as a congregation of courage. Before we jump in with both feet into this topic, let me share with you, first of all, why this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. They say that sometimes our greatest strengths can also become our greatest weaknesses. And I can certainly see that playing out in my own life on a regular basis. For me, one of the things I consider to be a strength is simply that I like people. There aren't too many people I can think of that I can't manage to get along with. And I think that's helped me along the way in providing leadership in the church. But while I like people, there's also a shadow side to that. And that shadow side is that I like people to like me. And this shadow side can sometimes become a problem, especially when it comes to our topic for today, that of courage. Because courage means that sometimes God is going to call me to do something or to say something or not to do something or not to say something that will lead others to not liking me very well. And I've discovered in me that there can be at times this unhealthy fear of others. What I mean by that is that there are times in my life when people seem really, really big and God seems really small. And instead of having the courage to act out of obedience to God, I will choose the road of people-pleasing instead. Because in those moments, people are big and God is small. It's something I need to be constantly on guard about to ensure that when I act or when I speak, that it's done out of obedience to God and not out of fear to others. And as I've served in the church, and as I've talked with other Christians and observed their lives and heard their struggles, I've observed something. I've discovered that I'm not alone in this. That if truth be told, there are many people in our churches, even many leaders in our churches, that suffer from this disease where people are big and God is small. Maybe today you recognize that you are infected with this disease as well. Now, as we wrestle with courage as followers of Jesus, we need to recognize that we live in a culture that in this day and age is specifically engineered to discourage courage in our lives as Christians. As Atlantic Canadian Christians here in North America, we find ourselves as fish swimming in the murky swamp water mixture of four powerful sources that are at work in our society, whose aim is to shape our hearts and our minds in a certain way. These are pluralism, rationalism, postmodernism, and secularism. Now, without taking time to define what these various isms are, let me say that each of these isms have a key message in common with one another as they relate to faith. And it's the message that it's best to keep what you believe to yourself. Pluralism says your way to God is no better than mine, so please keep your way to yourself because you're offending me by insisting that your road is better than my road. And rationalism says there is no God, so please, if you insist on believing in myths, keep it to yourself, because we're not interested. Postmodernism says we're all makers of our own truth, and you're doing violence to me by forcing your own truth claims on me. So please stop this war on my soul by keeping your truth to yourself. And then finally, secularism says there's no place for faith in the public sphere because it's so divisive, so please keep your religion at home. So this is the culture we're swimming in, a culture that at every turn meets us with the message, just keep it to yourself. Faith has no place in the public sphere. And while the Holy Spirit is continually seeking to shape us into the image and likeness of Christ, where we are naive to think that we aren't also being shaped and molded by the culture that we swim in. And it's happening largely in subtle ways that we can't even readily detect. So I want to argue then that in worship on any given Sunday in our churches, there are many people who have spent their whole week swimming in this water and whose hearts have been shaped and molded to believe that part of being a good citizen of this nation and getting along well in our culture means that faith is something that I do on my own time. And when large chunks of the people in your church, to greater or lesser degrees, have been shaped by culture in this way, many of them don't even recognize that they've been shaped in this way. And what you end up having is a very barren environment for courage to grow in and in which to flourish. So when we're talking about leading our churches to become courageous churches, I simply want us to name the fact that we're living in a culture that is specifically engineered to, in very subtle ways, discourage courage in people of faith. But I believe the root causes of this disease, where people are big and God is small and courage fails, goes much deeper than simply blaming the culture that we live in. No, this disease has its roots, I believe, in a faulty perception of God. And I want to suggest today that this disease that I'm speaking of is a disease of the eyes that distorts the way that we see God. It's a disease that causes things to appear out of proportion to one another. When we look at people or issues or circumstances, they look huge in our eyes. But then when we cast our eyes upon God, he looks really, really small in comparison. And so I want to suggest then that the cure for this disease is that we need to be fitted with a new set of glasses, some corrective lenses, so that we can see God and people, issues, and circumstances in correct proportion to one another. And at the heart of this whole business of living with courage as a follower of Jesus is a question. And that question is, can God be trusted? Now, of course, our head immediately wants to answer yes to that question. And ask that question on a Sunday morning to your congregation, and I'm sure that many people would answer with a resounding, yes, we can trust God. But in order for us in our churches to be able to live with courage in this world, there needs to be an affirmative answer to this question, not just from our head, but also from deep within our heart. Can God be trusted with my life? Can God be trusted with my family? Can God be trusted with my church? Can God be trusted with my job? Can God be trusted with my finances? Can God be trusted with my needs? Can God be trusted to sovereignly govern this world? And of course, again, our head wants to say yes to all of these things. But as they attach that question to some specific circumstances in our lives and in our world, our heart, on the other hand, may say something very different. Fear may arise because in one or more of these areas in our lives, we aren't sure that God can be trusted and that he's got a handle on things. This disease that we've been talking about has affected how we see and it's distorted our vision of God. In one of or more areas of our lives, we're no longer confident that we can trust God, and courage, therefore, begins to wither and die, and fear begins to sprout and grow. So here's the crux of what I want to say today. Write this down and you'll have this talk in a nutshell. Confidence in God is the cornerstone of courage. Confidence in God is the cornerstone of courage. If I can trust that God has me securely in the palm of his hand when I'm facing this person or this issue or this circumstance, then courage begins to emerge. But if I begin to wonder if maybe what I'm now facing is too big for God, or maybe you won't come through on this one, then courage begins to fail. Confidence in God is the cornerstone of courage. What I want us to, in the remainder of this talk today, to do is simply to try and stir up confidence in God. We all, to some extent, have been attacked by this disease where our vision of God has become distorted. And I simply today want to hand you a set of corrective lenses with the prayer that in the rest of our time together that our vision of God might come back into its proper focus, and that he might become big again, and that whatever else might seem big in our lives today, that it might become small as we look at God. What I have to share in the rest of this talk I don't think will be anything new or earth-shattering, but sometimes we need to go back and walk those ancient pathways again as we're reminded of the greatness and the awesomeness of our God. In 2 Kings 6, Elisha and his servant are in the city of Dothan, and the entire city has been surrounded in the night by the army of Aram, who are seeking to capture Elisha. When Elisha's servant gets up in the morning and he looks out the window, he sees this massive army surrounding the city, and the question, can God be trusted, looms large in his mind. It's obvious that the disease that we've been talking about today has attacked his eyes, because all that he can see in the moment is that huge army, and panic sets in. And so in 2 Kings 6, verse 15, we read that he cries out to Elisha in fear, "Oh no, my Lord, what shall we do?" For Elisha's servant, people have become big, and God has become small. And his confidence in God has been shaken, and therefore his courage fails. Now I want us to cut this servant a little bit of slack today, and to give credit where credit is due. It took the entire Aramean army to elicit this response from this man and to cause him to be fearful. I'm afraid, however, that for many of us as followers of Jesus, that number is a whole lot less when the fear of others begins to melt any courage inside of us and cause us to retreat. In fact, sometimes it can just take one person that holds the power of fear over us in such a way that our courage to live by faith evaporates into thin air. But Elisha, in contrast to his servant, sees the world very differently. He's got his God glasses on. When Elisha looks over that plain and looks out and sees the city surrounded by the Aramean army, his eyes see the true reality of the situation. This is what we read in verses 16 and 17 of 2 Kings 6. "Do not be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Can God be trusted? Well, when Elisha looks out, he doesn't see the Aramean army. Instead, he sees a world charged with the power and the presence of God. He saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around. He saw a world that God was still very much in control of. He is confident as he looks out that God has a handle on the situation, and courage rises up from within him as a result. Confidence in God is the cornerstone of courage, and Elisha's confidence in God never wavers. When you look out at the world, what do you see? When the people of your church look out at the world, what do they see? Do you see a world where nations or peoples or interest groups or corporations are in control? Where people are big and God is small? Or do you and they see a world charged with the power and the presence of God, where God is big and people are small? You see, the way in which we see the world in relation to God makes all the difference. Are we living in a world where God is but a minor player in a much bigger plot, where power and authority are up for grabs? Or when you look at the world, do you see a world where God is firmly in control, directing all things towards a good and purposeful end? Courage comes when we are confident that we are living in God's world and where He is sovereignly in control of all things. I want to introduce you today to the Church Road Gang. Now, that's not a name that they would use to refer to themselves, mind you. The Church Road Gang was my title for them, and when spoken, it was always done with a bit of a snarl. Do you know what the Church Road Gang did today? Or the Church Road Gang has crossed the line this time. As a child growing up in the rough and tumble streets of Shag Harbor, Shelburne County, Nova Scotia, the Church Road Gang were my arch nemesis. How the Church Road Gang came into being explains to a large extent our rivalry. There was a time many, many eons ago, before sliced bread was invented, way back in the late 1970s, when all of our parents attended the same church. But as can sometimes happen in that bastion of harmony and peace known as the church, trouble arose and sides were taken, and an explosion eventually went off. And one piece of the fallout from that explosion was that most of the young families who were in that church left. In fact, all of the families in that church left. All that is, except for my parents. Even though it broke their hearts because most of their friends had just walked out the door, my parents decided to stay, leaving my sister and I for a time as the only children in the entire congregation. But these folks who left the church didn't just leave, as you might imagine. No, it was incumbent upon them to start a new church. And so, not long after, less than a kilometer up the road from the church they left, they built a new church and established a Christian school there for their children. Now guess where that new church was built. It was built up a long dirt road right next to my home. The only thing separating us was a thin stretch of forest owned by the Irving Oil Company. When I was young, my parents rarely talked about why it was that there were two Baptist churches in our community, and I would have been too young to remember much about the founding of that church next door to our home. It was just the way that things were. And to my recollection, my parents never badmouthed in my hearing any of the families who left our home church either. Yet, bad blood runs deep. Somehow, I determined early on my childhood that the children who attended the Christian school and the church next door were not my friends. And it was obvious that they had the same assessment of me. The children that I had sat next to in the cribs in the nursery, the children who attended my early birthday parties and I attended theirs, were now, for some reason unbeknownst to me, they were now the enemy. The battles that had been fought in church meetings had, without warning, leached out onto the playground, and a new generation had taken up arms. Now, mind you, it was never really a fair fight. The combatants were just me, my best friend Matthew, and sometimes my sister Laura Lee, against the 8 boys and sometimes 2 girls that I had secretly begun calling the Church Road Gang. And ground zero of this war was that thin stretch of forest that separated my home from their church. This was no man's land, and on any given day, who controlled this precious piece of real estate was up for grabs. Many years of my childhood were spent locked in this perennial battle of wills with the Church Road Gang, and minor skirmishes and covert ops were the order of many late afternoons. There was the constant building up and destruction of rival forts to keep us busy. And then there were the jousting competitions with the 8-foot bean poles that Timothy, a member of the Church Road Gang, had stolen from his grandfather's garden. I remember the day that I found my wagon smashed in the middle of no man's land. That wagon that I had been pulled on as a toddler. The wagon that I had wheeled my overstuffed Smurf in the community children's parade. The wagon that I had gone careening down hills on, holding on for dear life. This constant companion of my early childhood had fallen into the hands of the Church Road Gang. And all that was left now were some bent wheels and a pile of splintered wood. Arr! The Church Road Gang strikes again. Well, one year flowed into another in this perpetual fight for no man's land until one day the scorecard got changed. My dad had been eyeing up that stretch of land between our house and the church for some time, hoping to be able to buy it. And Irvin Oil was never willing to sell that land, but eventually they lost interest in the property and called to see if Dad was still interested in buying it. Of course, he was, and soon a deal was done, the land was bought, and overnight, no man's land became my father's land. Now, being the humble young snot-nose that I was, I could not be more delighted at this news. I was practically diddling in my shoes the next day to get out the door after arriving home from school. I could hear the kids from the church school outside playing after class, and I raced over to the property line that separated the church's property from the Irvin Oil property, now my father's property, and I climbed up onto one of the big rocks that had been placed along the length of the property line when the church had been built. And like a conquering warrior king arriving to announce victory to the defeated peasants of a foreign land, I stood up there tall and proud. Well, my sudden appearance caused a bit of a stir as some of the kids came rushing over to see why the enemy had all of a sudden emerged from the woods. And it was there, as I looked down from on high, that I had the joy of making my inaugural proclamation as the new ruler in waiting of the acquired lands. With all the puffed up arrogance and authority that my 12-year-old self could muster, I announced, "This is now my father's land. You are not allowed to cross over this line, ever." And then I faded off back into the woods to explore the newly conquered territory. Now, I'm not suggesting that my motives were right here, and I'm happy to say that today the Church Road Gang and I are all friends, or at least happy acquaintances, but everything changed the day that my father bought the land. This was now my father's land. No man's land was no longer no man's land. This was my father's land. It belonged to him now. There was an authority that he had over the land that did not exist before. He could dictate who did or did not go on the land. He could decide what the land was and was not used for. And when I stepped onto that land, I was no longer stepping out into unknown, dangerous territory, but I was still at home on the land of my Father. I want to ask you today, as you live in this world as a follower of Jesus Christ, whose land do you believe that you're living on? You see, we act far too often as though this world is no man's land. We see the world through the eyes of Elisha's servant, that who controls the world is an uncertain thing, and that we cannot be confident as Christians living in this world of who's in charge. And so our courage fails time and time and time again. But that's not what the Bible declares is true about this world we're living in. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, Psalm 24 declares. And in Psalm 22 we read, dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. Speaking of Jesus, Paul says, and God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be the head over everything. As a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ, we are living in God's world. He is in control. This is Dad's land. And one of the ways I believe that we can help ourselves and our churches grow into greater health is by making it a goal in our worship, in our life together as a church, to not shy away from the greatness of God. Yes, there are some Sundays when I need to come to worship and be reminded that Jesus is my friend and my brother who loves me and is with me in a very close and intimate way. But I also need to be reminded that Jesus is so much more. He's the one who has risen from the dead, who triumphed over every power and principality, that he is the one who today reigns over all things, that he is for us, not against us, that evil is hemmed in by his hand, and that one day he is returning to set all things right. I need a Jesus that I am confident that no power of hell and no scheme of man can triumph over. When that is the Jesus that looms large in my mind, that's a Jesus that sparks courage in me, and that's a Jesus that can empower our churches to live courageously in this world. Well, God's richest blessing upon you, and may you now go out into God's world and live with courage. Amen.
Hey, thanks for listening to today's episode of the Healthy Christian Leader podcast. We really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please consider leaving a review. And if you're looking to grow with like-minded Christian leaders, consider engaging with our online community. You can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, or you can check out our website at aaronministries.com.